perfect knowledge, that you can prove everything, and once you have proved, that's it, and there's nothing you cannot prove. Well, Gödel showed that even in something as limited as arithmetic, there are theorems that are correct, but you cannot prove within the system of arithmetic. You have to go outside arithmetic to prove them. Okay? That meant that, in fact, that's one thing he proved. Okay. The other thing he proved was that there were things that in fact it could be, you could not demonstrate whether in fact two contradictory theorems. Well, let me restate that. The other thing he proved was that in fact there were situations in which the truth of a proposition and its falsehood would simultaneously exist. Okay? I mean, these are weird things. Totality of it came to be called the Gödel's incompleteness theorem, and it messed up the mathematical world. At least it messed up the world of those people who were interested in the foundations of mathematics. The working mathematicians, they just went about their merry business, doing their stuff, but it really didn't matter to them. Okay? But, people like Hilbert, who had so, thought that the mathematics was this complete system, precise system, their whole universe sort of collapsed. This happened in 1932, I think it was, okay? Sometime during that time. This was an amazing time, because a few years before that, a man called Heisenberg, Werner Heisenberg, a German physicist, had in fact demonstrated something called the uncertainty principle. Okay? Have you heard of that?
Yes.
And what is the uncertainty principle? I won't put you on the spot, I'll let you know. What it is that in fact, scientists think that when you observe something, you don't interfere with that observation. Okay, now if every observation or if any observation was such that the scientist's act of observing messed that up, then you can't do any objective experiments. Well, in fact, what Heisenberg showed was that for subatomic phenomena, the act of observing certain things affected the observation. It messed it up, right? Which meant that there were limits to what you could observe. Okay? So what was happening in the 1920s and early 1930s were these amazing discoveries that was literally messing up, the scientists, nicely comfortable, their comfortable universe. Okay? The mathematicians suddenly realized that there were true theorems which you cannot prove to be true. And in fact, you could not demonstrate the inconsistency of two contradictory theorems. The physicists realized that, in fact, what they'd taken to be absolutely sacrosanct, inviolable principle, that when you observe something, you don't mess up with that observation. What you are observing does not get messed up. In fact, that is not the case. Okay? So this was a time of great revolution. Well, one of the open problems that Hilbert identified in 1900, and he came back to that, was, and I'm going to sort of say it in very broad terms, okay? It has to do with a class of problems called Diophantine equations. But basically what it boiled down to was the following. He asked, is there a mechanical procedure? Is there a definite procedure that we can follow, which will demonstrate whether a mathematical problem is solvable or not? Okay? It's not trying to solve that problem. It's simply to indicate whether in fact the problem can be solved at all. In other words, if I give you a mathematical problem, even if you get to it, you're not going to waste your time working on that problem unless you know it's solvable. Right? Now, is there a mechanical procedure, is a definite procedure by which you could actually demonstrate whether in fact that problem is solvable or not? Okay? This came to be called, and to impress people, you have to use foreign words. Okay? So here's the word that I'm going to give to you, and spend the weekend memorizing it. Okay? Entscheidungsproblem, a German word. It means decision problem. It means trying to make a decision, right? So, I mean, it sounds so great, doesn't it? I've solved the Entscheidungsproblem, okay? Rather than decision problem. So I like to impress people with this. So this was the problem that Hilbert asked. Is there, in fact, a definite procedure which can, in fact, demonstrate or prove whether a problem is solvable or not? The decision problem. This is where Alan Turing enters the picture. Now this Hilbert sort of reiterated this, as I said, in 1928. This is 2012, it's Turing's birth centenary, so he was born in 1912, so he was at that time about 26 years old, right? Now Turing, by all accounts, I actually happen to have known people who personally knew Turing, and I've talked to them in the past about, he was an extraordinary character, okay? But he was certainly very, very brilliant, okay? He studied in Cambridge, in England, Cambridge University. Now in Cambridge, they have a peculiar system where the university administers the exams, but the actual classes, the instruction given to the students, to the undergraduates in particular, happen to be in individual colleges. These colleges are not like College of Science or College of Liberal Arts. They're actually independent institutions, such as Trinity College, where Newton studied, and Newton, in fact, lived for a long time, King's College, etc., etc. Each of these colleges is like an independent corporate body. They have their own fellows, as they were called, which is really the professors who would teach students. And the way students were taught in Cambridge, in these colleges, was not through lectures. They would be through tutorials. They'd get together with their tutors as they were called, in the guy's room, in his office room, and they would interact, if you wish, So that was how it was done. Well, Turing was an undergraduate at King's College in Cambridge, okay, one of the more famous of the Cambridge colleges, and that was there when, at that time, this is by the way, I'm talking about a time when people like Bertrand Russell was a fellow of Trinity College, was teaching there. Alfred North Whitehead was still at Cambridge. So these were the guys who had laid the foundations of mathematical philosophy. And Turing came to, although he was taking a degree in mathematics, mathematicians do not necessarily interest themselves in mathematical philosophy, that is the foundation, but he was. He read Russell's Introduction to Mathematical Philosophy. He attended some of these courses, classes, lectures that these guys were giving, and he came to be acquainted with Hilbert's problem, including this problem, Edge-Scheid-Dunge problem, okay? And before we actually get into what happened, why, how he dealt with this, let's now sort of revert to something of his life itself. Okay, as I said at the beginning, even people like von Neumann, or even Babbage, actually, amongst the three people that I've identified, quite had the kind of attracted the attention of so many people outside science, outside mathematics, outside computing that Turing did. And there were reasons for it. And just to give you an example, there's a very well-known biography that was written about him by Andrew Hodges, and I'll get to that right at the end. Okay, 2 plays have been written about him, and one was produced and staged in London, and another in New York. And in fact, the New York one actually garnered 3 Tony Award nominations. Okay, a television film made by the BBC on Turing has been made. A novel has been written about him, with Turing as the main character. A musical even has been made, right? In Manchester, in England, one of the places where he lived and taught, and where he actually died, a road and a bridge are named after him. Statues of Turing are all over the place. In fact, I think in this article in Communication ACM, there is one picture of one of the statues that, and entire buildings have been named after him in Europe, in South America, and of course in America. Right? The world's most prestigious prize in computer science, the Turing Award, of course, is named after him, awarded by the ACM. And of course, in this year, the centenary of his birth, as I said, commemorative events, both scientific and cultural, are planned or already underway. Right? Now, a part of this fascination with Turing, right, comes from his, what we might say, the more tragic aspect of his life. He was a gay man. In England, in the 1950s, up to the time he passed away, being found homosexual, being discovered to be homosexual was illegal, right? In fact, the same laws had prevailed since the end of the 19th century. Oscar Wilde, the great playwright, who had been jailed because he had been found to be gay. The same laws prevailed into the mid-1950s, right? And Turing fell a victim of those laws. He was not jailed, but he was charged for quote-unquote gross indecency, right? He was not imprisoned, but he was put on probation, and listen to this, he had to, with the condition, he was put on probation with the condition that he submit himself for hormonal therapy, which would correct his gayness, make him straight, right? In September 2009, by the way, the then Prime Minister, Gordon Brown, issued a formal apology to Turing on behalf of the government. And he died in June 1954 of cyanide poisoning. The true causes of his suicide is not known, right? But the obvious thing is that all this had happened just a year or two before that, and so he was a very sensitive soul. There's no doubt about it. And this most people believe that the charge against him and the publicity that came out of it, the humiliation of it, was part and parcel, was responsible for his death. Okay, and of course he was personally, when he was living, he was incredibly eccentric. I have heard stories of Turing that when they were building one of the first computers that were being built at the National Physical Laboratory in just outside London, he was involved in that project. When I gave my talk on Wilkes sometime last year, I mentioned the fact that the first main memory in the computer was made out of mercury put into tanks, and ultrasound signals were sent to it. Well, Turing actually thought about combining, putting gin inside of the mercury, and he actually wanted to experiment putting whole tanks of gin, and running the ultrasound signals through it. Also, he wrote on a blackboard in reverse, in other words, B would be written like that instead of like that, okay? So in fact, people would get totally freaked out, when they observed him writing something on the board. So he was a very eccentric person, but he was absolutely brilliant, okay? His contributions in the realm of computer science essentially are threefold, okay? Here I can I'm really going to talk about one, and then probably something, one more if I have some time. He made contributions to what is now called theory of computing, automata theory, and how many of you have taken courses in theory of computing? I noticed that in the undergraduate, okay, so you can comfortably curse him for the trauma that you faced, So he actually literally established what came to be called automata theory, all right? And that I'll get back to a bit later on. He also was a practical designer. He actually designed real computers, okay? He was involved in the design of one of the machines, as I said, at the National Physical Laboratory, and so he had substantial contribution there. During the war, the thing that probably most non-computer scientists know about him is that he was deeply involved in code breaking. There's a place in London, in England, called Bletchley Park, right? Which is also sort of almost like a legendary, because that's where, the Germans had this code encrypting machine called the Enigma, all right? And what these guys at Bletchley Park had to do, and these were mathematicians almost entirely, what they had to do was to intercept, the intercepted code would be passed to them, and they would be in the business of trying to decode these messages, okay? Decoding or decryption, okay, of the coding. And along the way, they actually had to build machines, computers to do that. Turing was not involved in building computers to do that, but he was involved in the mathematical work, statistical and mathematical and algebraic work in decoding. So he was heavily involved in that. So a lot of the people know him because of his work on breaking the Enigma code during the Second World War. And his third computing contribution is, of course, in the realm of artificial intelligence. So what I'm going to do is we'll talk a bit about his first and his third, and see where that leads us. Okay. As I said, he studied mathematics in Cambridge. He was a very precocious guy. Even as an undergraduate, he proved a theorem in probability theory called the central limit theorem. Has anyone heard of that here? Okay? Anyone who's taken a course in probability theory will know that. It's a very fundamental theorem in probability theory. He actually proved it. This was in 1930 or 31 or thereabouts. Okay? To his chagrin, he discovered that in fact a very famous Russian mathematician had proved this and discovered this theorem, or proved it if you wish, at least a decade before. So that really came to naught as far as publication was concerned. But the people in King's College, they recognized his brilliance, because after all he had proved such a fundamental theorem, quite ignorant of the fact that someone else had proved it. And by virtue of that, when he graduated, when he got his BA degree in mathematics, in Cambridge, by the way, you don't get an MA, you don't do a master's by degree. You do a bachelor's degree, 5 years later you pay a fee and you get a master's degree. That's about it. But so the real degree is BA or BSc, as the case may be, and then the PhD. So he got a BA in mathematics, and by virtue of that, of this central limit theorem discovery or rediscovery, he was elected what they call a fellow of the college, which meant that he had a lifetime appointment at that college. He could go anywhere he wanted, but he had that lifetime appointment. The stipend that they were paid was a pittance. Poor people couldn't afford to be fellows, by the way. You had to have a fair amount of money tucked away somewhere but you had the prestige of being a fellow. And we're talking about a place where, at that time, John Maynard Keynes, arguably one of the most famous economists of the 20th century, was also a fellow. Was in fact one of his tutors at that time. Okay? So he became a fellow of King's College. Now, even as an undergraduate, that he encountered Hilbert's decision problem, Inch-Schein-Lunch problem. Okay? Sometime after he graduated in 1934, in the summer of 1935, he was now a fellow of King's College, had the time to do whatever he wanted in terms of mathematics. He decided to think of this problem. And he asked himself in the thought, and sort of reiterating Hilbert's question, he asked, is there a mechanical procedure, which we would call an algorithm, which can decide whether a mathematical proposition, was provable or not? And as soon as he thought about a mechanical procedure, he began to think of a machine that could do that. But the machine that Turing was beginning to conceive was a far cry from the world of gears, of levers, of switches, of racks and pinions, of pulleys, circuits, powered by steam, electricity, water power, etc. These were machines that people knew. The stuff of which, these are the stuff of the real machines. Even computing machines in those days were electromechanical gizmos. Okay? Turing's vision of a machine belonged not to the world of physical artifacts, but to the world of squiggles, or precisely squiggles that represented things. In other words, it was a world of symbols and symbol processing. Right? His machine processed symbols. Now, the point is that even before Turing, there were other machines that were processing symbols. You folks won't know, but when I was an engineering undergraduate, our main calculating device was something called a slide rule. Anyone heard of a slide rule here? Right? Anyone seen a slide rule? Right? Okay, well, in fact, the other day, one of the CAT students brought me his father's slide rule, and I realized that I completely forgotten how to use it. I couldn't use it, and yet for 5 years in my engineering, I had to do that. Anyway, but the point is that the slide rule, like any other computational device, is still processing symbols. There's no doubt about it. So it's not just the fact of processing symbols that was the essence of his problem. His machine itself was a symbolic machine. It was abstract. You can't build a physical machine, which we now call a Turing machine. You can't build a physical machine. Right? So his machine was arguably, I would imagine, the first contraption, artifact that we could think of as an abstract machine. That is, it had no physical significance. The machine itself was symbolic. Okay? So that was how he was thinking. In May 1936, he submitted a long paper to the London Mathematical Society, the proceedings. And the title of this was, let me read it up to you, on computable numbers with an application to the N-Schein-Lunch problem. Right? The important thing, though, is with an application to this. So that this problem, the decision problem itself, did not become his main thing. What he was interested in is the concept of computability, computable numbers. What is it we mean by computation, right? So the main issue was computable numbers. The Edge-High-Dukes problem was almost an application, the secondary problem. And we'll return to that briefly later on. Okay. Now, I'm not going to get into the finer points of computable numbers. You know, anyone who's taken a course of theory of computing or automata will have dealt with that issue. Right? But what is important is that he dealt with symbols. All right. Okay. The heart of the matter, right, for Turing was to determine what it meant for a machine to perform the task we intuitively, purely intuitively, and naturally call computing. Right? What is it we mean? I mean, we use the word computing all the time. I mean, we now certainly, but even in those days they used it, right? So what exactly, you know, we had an intuitive notion of what is computing. So what he wanted to do is to come up with a machine that could formalize this intuitive notion of computing. Right? Now, the other point you must remember is that there were no machines that were called computers in 1936. A computer was a human being who computed. You know, you actually hired, and as it so happened, you know, and forgive me ladies, you know, it was all the women who did the computing, right? They were hired, you know, and they were given these machines, and you said, okay, go and compute. And so the term computer in the 1930s meant human computers, human beings who did the computing. So here's what he asked. What is it that a human computer does when they do computing? And so it was a purely, you know, so he thought of, you know, it was a manual procedure. So he laid it out. He says basically what happens is that, and in those days, you know, I sometimes realize that I really do belong to an earlier generation, okay? Because what Turing talked about was the fact that kids learn arithmetic by taking square pieces of paper with squares divided into squares. Are you familiar with this idea? No, okay. Well, this is what we did when I was learning arithmetic. We had a sheet of paper, not with horizontal lines, but horizontal and vertical lines, so each little square, and we'd put a number 2 in one square, a 3 in another square, etc., etc. Mark, are you familiar with that? Okay.
I'm not bad.
All right. So what he did is, okay, that's what people do. That's what kids do, right? You actually have a paper and you write down numbers, and he said, started thinking, okay, let's begin with that. But he said that, you know, having a square paper is not important. The paper could be on a linear strip, right? Hence the Turing tape, the tape. The tape was unbounded. It would be never ending from one end to another. It would be divided into little squares or cells, and you'd put symbols in them. So that was the starting point. Okay? But also, we talk about the human computer, right? And that human computer has certain perceptual and cognitive characteristics, traits that affect his behavior. In particular, the computer's behavior, that is, a human computer's behavior, is determined by the symbols he's observing and his state of mind at that point of time. Depending on the symbol he's observing and his state of mind, and I'm quoting Turing, his state of mind, he or she will then put another symbol onto the tape, you know, and cause his state of mind to change. But at the same time, there are limits to what a human computer, the number of symbols that the human computer can observe at a time, right? If there's only this sort of narrow window that they can observe, okay? I mean, because of cognitive limitations. If you want to observe more numbers, more symbols, you have to do a second observation to the next part of the piece of paper or the tape. And then he said, and I'm quoting here, we must suppose that the number of states of mind which need to be taken into account is finite. So in fact, even though the tape may be infinite, right, the number of states of mind that a human computer has to go through, we have to assume is finite. There's only so many states, okay? So now we have our second characteristic of this machine. It's a machine which can have a finite number of different states, or in this case, states of mind. Right? Turing then went on. He imagined the operations performed by the computer to be split into simple operations that cannot be further divided, elemental operations. What were these? Well, firstly, they must allow to change the symbols on the tape, right? Also change from looking at the tape at one point to one square to go to another square, you know, further down or left or right. And finally, to change the state of the mind, if you wish, you know. All this, Turing said, pertained to a human computer. He then envisioned a machine to do the work of the human computer. To each state of mind, corresponds a state of the machine. So we have this concept of a machine state. The machine scans a number of squares corresponding to the number of squares observed by the human computer. In any move, depending on the symbol scanned and the present state of mind, or the machine can change the symbol on the scanned square, move certain number of positions to the left or right of the tape, and have a change of state in itself. This results in a machine changing state, and this then was the machine that he could see. And he called it, in his paper, he called it a computing machine. Now we call it the Turing machine in his honor. Now, supposing that such a machine is given a tape, just as a matter of curiosity, how many of you are familiar with Turing machines? Okay, so you know what I'm talking about, right? But I'm sort of going back to his original concept in the original language. Okay? Suppose that such a machine is given a tape with some input set of symbols in it and placed in some initial state, right? And then is set in motion. Then any sequence of symbols that are printed by the machine on the tape is said to be computed by that machine. There will then be a distinct Turing machine in our language for each different kind of computation, different kind of problem. In mathematical terms, of course, we say a Turing machine's output will be a function of its input. So really, a Turing machine will compute a function f. So every Turing machine will compute a distinct function. And that's what it boils down to. In our terms, it means that a computing machine, a Turing machine, is a specific Turing machine is a special purpose computer. It can only do one thing. But he had a larger ambition. He envisioned a Turing machine which could simulate any other Turing machine. Right? That is, he envisioned how a general purpose computing machine would look like. He called this a universal computing machine. We call it a universal Turing machine. Right? And it would have the capacity to store a description of any particular Turing machine on that same tape, right? And it would be let loose, and the Turing machine would then interpret the description of another Turing machine, and actually simulate its behavior. Thereby, the universal machine could do anything that a particular computing machine could do. That, of course, is our idea of a programmable, or rather a stored program computer, and which raises all kinds of interesting questions. I'll get back to that in a minute. But let's get back to his original, the Hilbert problem. What about the decision problem? What about the Entscheidungs problem, which began this whole train of thought? Is there a definite method, Hilbert had asked, that can decide the provability or unprovability of a mathematical proposition? Right? And Turing, in his 1936 paper, said no. Right? The way that he goes about it is to use this Turing machine, and in fact it led to what is called the halting problem. The Turing machine, given that kind of problem, to ask whether a given mathematical proposition is true or not, or provable or not, would never actually halt. It would never stop. Okay? Therefore, you never know whether you can prove or disprove the case may be. So that's another important theoretical, from a mathematical point of view, a very important idea. So what had Turing done in this 1936 paper, essentially? He had formalized our intuitive notion of an effective procedure, or what is called an algorithm. The term effective procedure is the older term that is actually, it's the term that mathematicians and logicians used to use. We, of course, computer scientists call it an algorithm. Right? So what he had done is he had formalized what was entirely an intuitive, informal notion of an effective procedure, in terms of a Turing machine. What he had done was to claim that any process which naturally or intuitively seems to be an effective procedure can be implemented on a Turing machine. Right? This statement that any process, any procedure that is naturally or intuitively seems to be an effective procedure or an algorithm can be implemented on this machine, that is on his Turing machine, that proposition is now called, has come to be called, the Turing's thesis. Right? And the point, of course, is, it's very important for you to understand, it's certainly worth realizing this is called a Turing's thesis. Not Turing's law, not Turing's theorem. Because you can't prove this. You can't prove it because it begins with an intuitive idea about computing is. So what he's really saying is, look, you and I, we're always chatting about something called computing. Well, what the heck is it? So what he had in fact done was invent, if you wish, a definition of computing in terms of this machine. This, he said, is what computing is all about. Right? Now, it's a thesis, so you can't prove it or disprove it. Okay? And of course, the burden then falls on someone saying that, okay, here is something else that I think is computing, but it cannot be done by Turing's machine. Right? Now, that situation has not arisen because we don't know of anything that is not intuitively satisfied by Turing's thesis. So this was, of course, the most fundamental result. But remember, the Turing machine is an abstract machine. Again, no one would actually think of building such a machine. But its significance in the history of computer science, in the history of computing, lies in its consequences. Right? Firstly, this idea of a universal Turing machine. Right? What that meant is that, in fact, a universal Turing machine is a way of binding, of bringing together all possible individual Turing machines, special purpose Turing machines. Okay? So you have this idea of a machine that can do any kind of computation whatsoever, right? Simply by simulating a special computation on that machine. Right? But also, of course, his invention led to its own intellectual adventure, its own discipline, which we now call automata theory. The term automata theory is interesting, by the way, because it begins with this notion of automaton, which precedes computing by at least 3 centuries. Okay? The term automaton was actually coined in the 17th century to mean gadgets that could do physical things that human beings could do. Physical things. Okay? These were really toys. Way back in the time of the Greeks, there were inventors who designed, for example, one automaton that was designed at the time was that you went in front of a faucet, and you didn't have to tell anything. As soon as you went in front of the faucet, the water would fall. Okay, so these kinds of things is done purely mechanically, of course, none of that. But what is important is that these were essentially invented by people, by these ingenious inventors, craftsmen, and all that, for the benefit and the amusement of the rich. They would have them all over the house and would be shown. But at a more city level, in the medieval times, you'd have these churches and all that, and then it said the clock would strike 12. Well, what would happen is that when the clock struck 12, all kinds of toys, figures would come out, and someone would be playing the drum, someone would be playing a trumpet, all that stuff, as long as the clock was striking, and then it would sort of disappear. These were automata. If anyone's been to London, there's a place there called Leicester Square. Anyone been to London here? Okay. Have you been to Leicester Square? You must have hung out there. All young people hang out in Leicester Square. Well, in Leicester Square, there's actually a shop, a store there, and at the top, and everyone's there. At particular times of the day, you find these gizmos coming out, and everyone's looking up and oohing and eyeing and all that. So that's what automaton was. What he did, what automata theory did, was transfer the notion of an automaton to the realm of the thinking human being, right? Not just doing physical, like drumming drums or playing the trumpet or what have you, or allowing water to fall. It actually meant trying to simulate how humans think. So the term automaton was sort of appropriated by computing people to mean something quite different. And as you know, automata theory is, in fact, the whole body of notion of ideas and concepts and rules and principles and discoveries, etc., having to do with Turing machines and their extensions. Okay? How much do I have?
10 minutes left. But if you need more, you can take it.
I won't watch it. Okay. 1936 was when this paper was published, right? Universal Computing Machine. The first stored program computer was conceived, not built, conceived in 1945, 9 years later. So in fact, when the Turing machine paper, Turing published this paper, there were no, well, computer, of course, the term wasn't there, not to mean machines, it was meant human beings, but they were called calculating machines at the time. But there were none of these machines that existed, and they included, very well-known devices such as the differential analyzer in MIT and all that stuff. But none of them were actually programmed. That is, they did not have programs stored in the memory itself. The ENIAC, which was built, which became operational in 1946, which was built at the Moore School in Philadelphia, was not a stored program computer. It was actually a machine that did computations, but you actually had to plug in your program through turning switches, inserting cables and all that. So the program lay outside. The idea of a stored program computer was conceived in 1945. And the person whose name is most associated with it is John von Neumann. In fact, anyone who's taken an elementary course in computer architecture would come across the term the von Neumann architecture. Now there's a lot of controversy concerning the actual idea of who conceived it, right? The fact of the matter is that the von Neumann was one of several people who were involved in the discussions. But the fact remains that in 1945, von Neumann wrote a memorandum, a report. It was never published. It was never published in any journal. But he wrote the paper which described the concept of a stored program computer in 1945. Okay? It was circulated essentially by hand, and that's how the idea got around. Now, here's a question. The universal Turing machine had this idea of a program, which is a description of a special Turing machine, which you put on the tape, and the control part of the Turing machine would actually read that and interpret it and perform the task on the Turing machine itself, the universal Turing machine. This is exactly what a stored program computer is. A stored program computer stores a program which is interpreted by the processing unit and the control unit in such a fashion that any particular piece of computation can be performed by this very general computing device. Right? So there is a direct correspondence between the universal Turing machine, functionally, I mean, not in terms of efficiency and all that, functionally, and the stored program general purpose computer. Question is, was von Neumann influenced by Turing's work? Okay? Or to put that another way, to what extent should Turing be given credit for the invention of the stored program computer, that is a practical computer? Now, the history of this whole business of, as I said, of the discovery of the invention of the stored program computing principle is extremely complex. There were people all over, in America, Bell Labs, Harvard University, IBM, MIT, Moore School of Electrical Engineering, and University of Iowa. They all had people who were working on some aspect of this. Okay? In Britain, there was Cambridge University, University of Manchester, the National Physical Laboratory, where later on Turing worked. They were involved, and in Germany, of course, we're talking about during the Second World War. In Germany, of course, there was a Technical University of Berlin where stuff was going on. Okay? So it's a very complicated situation. But as far as is known, none of these people, with one exception, none of the people involved, with one exception, knew about Turing's 1936 paper. These guys were physicists, applied mathematicians, electrical engineers. Turing's paper came out was a purely mathematical paper in pure mathematics and logic. Okay, so it is very unlikely that they would even be interested in that. The exception was John von Neumann. Right? Now, von Neumann had actually met Turing in Cambridge in 1935. Right? Then next year, Turing went to Princeton, where von Neumann was working at the Institute of Advanced Study, which is where Gödel was, and Einstein, and the other people, and next to Institute of Advanced Study was the Princeton University, and there this other great logician was working, a guy called Church, Alonzo Church, right? And Turing went to work with him for his PhD. He stayed there for 2 years to work on his PhD. So at that time, von Neumann, again, sort of re-met, if you wish, Turing. Right? Now, the question is that, in fact, it seems almost inconceivable that von Neumann, by the way, I should mention, was a man of insatiable curiosity. There was nothing in any aspect of science or, or mathematics that did not, or logic for that matter, that did not interest him. And he had an incredible mind. So, he would pounce on any topic which he felt he could contribute to and make that topic his own. Okay? And so it is almost inconceivable that here was Alan Turing working on this fundamental idea in mathematical, in computability, which is really part of logic, rather than computing as such, that von Neumann would not have talked about it with him. Okay? Moreover, the proofs for this paper were first delivered to Turing in Princeton while he was there. Right? Finally, our third issue is that, in fact, von Neumann wrote a letter of reference for Turing to extend his fellowship to stay at Princeton. So it's almost inconceivable that von Neumann didn't know about it. However, there is still no direct evidence that he did know about this paper, except one thing. This is during the war, remember? Second World War, right? Just after this, the Second World War started, the atom bomb project started in Los Alamos, and von Neumann was working there. And there he had a physicist friend called Frankel, who wrote, and I quote him here. According to Frankel, in a letter he wrote to a computer scientist in England, Frankel said, von Neumann firmly emphasized to me and to others, I'm sure, that the fundamental concept of the stored program computer is owing to Turing. In my view, von Neumann's essential role was in making the world aware of these fundamental concepts introduced by Turing and others. In fact, if that is the case, if indeed von Neumann felt that the stored program concept was due to was hugely influenced by Turing's work, then it would lend a completely different texture to the history of computer science, and everything that is said about the von Neumann computer would have to be rewritten. In fact, should be rewritten to reflect Turing's contribution to that. It is almost, it seems almost certain that there was some influence there. Now, of course, the influence would be in terms of concept. It's quite one thing to write to do an abstract Turing machine on paper and to actually build a physical computer. They're two different things. Okay? All right, so this is his first great contribution. Okay? And in the remaining time, let me just say the following. Let me just fast forward, if you wish, the Turing tape, right, to the end of the 1940s. By this time, 2 digital computers had been built. 2 electronic stored program computers had been built. One was in Cambridge, in England. The first one, in fact, EDSAC, due to Maurice Wilkes and his group. And the other was in Manchester, which came to be called the Manchester Automatic Digital Machine, or MADDEN, okay, which was built in the same year, but later on in the year. I have to have spent time teaching in Manchester and spent time visiting fellow Cambridge, and it's amazing that when I was in Cambridge, I would support the Cambridge guys as priority. When I was in Manchester, I would never, talk about Cambridge as having preceded them. They were fierce rivals, and they're still sort of ruminate over this, who actually invented the first operation computer. But in 1949, the first 2 stored program computers had been built. The imagination of people had been caught by this completely new machine. In 1949, right, same year that these 2 machines were built, an American, Edmund Berkeley, who was a founding member of ACM, okay, in 1947, and also his first secretary, published a book, and he called it Giant Brains, or Machines That Think. The computer was beginning to be seen as a thinking machine, not just as a number cruncher. Right? Turing, by the way, remember, Turing had dealt with symbols. He had never thought of a computing machine as a numerical computer, numerical device. It was always a symbol processing device. And now, people were thinking of it as a thinking machine. Right? And one of the areas that attracted people's attention was whether the computer could play chess. Right? One of the scientists who latched onto this issue was a man called Claude Shannon. How many of you heard of Claude Shannon? Okay. Well, Shannon, of course, again you might curse him because he invented logic design, right? Switching theory and logic, applying Boolean algebra to logic design. Okay. But he also was the founder of information theory, what came to be called information theory. Right? But again, many of these guys, they just move from one area to another. And Shannon actually first wrote a paper on, wrote one of the earliest papers on whether you could get a computer to play chess. The other guy who was involved in this, who was interested in this problem was Turing. And in fact, in 1948, he wrote a report for his employer at that time, the National Physical Laboratory, on what he called it intelligent machines. But Turing's thoughts on thinking machines really came into the public notice in 1950. And he published an article called Computing Machinery and Intelligence, which was published in October of that year in a philosophical journal called Mind. Right? And it began with the question, can machines think? And he immediately said, look, that's a question that is too controversial. I mean, what does it mean for a machine to think? So he said, forget that question. Forget the question of can machines think. Imagine the following game. Imagine the following situation. Imagine having a computer or machine M in one room and a human being in another, and they are communicating with another human being, which I'll call the interrogator, in a third room. And the communication is through technological means, so that there's no way that their gender, the interrogator can make out whether, who's the human being and who is the computer, right? And the interrogator fires up questions to these two beings, okay? And they respond. And it is the interrogator's task to guess whether the answer is by the machine or by the human being. And Turing said if, in fact, for 30% of the responses that are given by these two, by these two entities, if, in fact, 30% of the time the interrogator can be fooled that into thinking wrongly that such and such is a machine and such is a human being, if the machine, in fact, can fool the interrogator 30% of the time, then we can say that, in fact, for all intents and purposes, the computer is able to do a process to indulge in a kind of thinking that we would deem to be intelligent. Right? This came to be called the Turing test. Right? And again, Turing was not responsible for that term. That came later on, again in his honor. But the Turing test sort of established an operational way of characterizing what it could mean for a computer to think. Because you see, the point is that this guy, the interrogator, can ask any questions. It means that the machine must not only understand natural language, but must understand, have a knowledge of the world, that it can respond to these questions. Okay? So if in fact that it could do so, Turing never questioned how that is to be done. That wasn't the issue here. He was pointing out that here is an operational definition of how this can happen. Okay? And that can be called the Turing test. Well, of course, the Turing test became the holy grail of what has come to be called artificial intelligence. AI really began in about 5 years after this paper came out, right? I mean, at least in terms of publications, but this became the holy grail. Okay? And ever since then, until very recently, because then people have sort of decided that it's too difficult the Turing test, to satisfy that. But until then, eventually, everyone was sort of contemplating that, they thought that, okay, this is my ticket to glory, right? If I can build a program or a machine that can actually that can satisfy the Turing test. Okay? Computer chess, of course, is a great example of that. And as I'm sure all of you know, there are now chess programs that have beaten grandmasters and world champions and all that stuff. Again, but still, the question is, then of course the question arises, how have they solved it? How have they beaten it? And that's a different question altogether. But what I'm saying is that what Turing did was, in fact, lay the groundwork, lay the foundation for what an AI researcher wanted to achieve, to have a machine that could actually fool a human interrogator, or at least behave in a fashion that would make people think that he or she, it rather, was a human being. Okay? Well, when Turing died, he was 42 years old. Right? He was at the prime of his scientific and intellectual powers. And what he would have achieved had he lived on, we can only speculate. Incidentally, 1 year after he committed suicide, John von Neumann passed away from cancer. And von Neumann was in his 50s. So two prodigiously gifted people who had made huge contributions to computer science passed away both prematurely, within the span of a year or two. Okay? Now here I've just sort of touched upon two of his major contributions to the Turing machine concept and the Turing test. Okay? There were others, as I said, whose imagination was caught by his work at Bletchley Park, this code-breaking stuff. For others, the circumstances of his particular lifestyle and how it affected his personal and intellectual life was what was most fascinating. Certainly, the most definitive biography of Turing, which was published in 1983 by a man called Andrew Hodges. He himself was a mathematician who was a gay activist who was involved very prominently in the gay liberation movement in England in the 1970s, and he was thus motivated to write this biography of Turing. Turing's mother, by the way, Sarah Turing, did write a little book about Turing, but she, being a mother, did not want to talk about these personal aspects. She just focused on non-controversial aspects. What Hodges did was, in fact, write something that would be as truthful as possible, given what evidence was available. Right? And in this year of his birth centenary, I'm sure there will be new projects that are that are already underway to discover, to find out more about this man, and new perspectives will probably emerge. But the fact of the matter is that he was an extraordinary, an enigmatic, a brilliant, an eccentric, and ultimately a tragic figure. Right. Thank you.
Would you like to answer questions?
Sure.
Does anyone have a question for Dr. Dasgupta?
Yeah, if he was at Cambridge at the same time as Russell and Whitehead, did he have interaction with them?
Oh yeah, well, Russell was much senior, of course. He was, Russell's great work, 1905, Principia Mathematica, was in 1905. So by this time, Russell was not doing serious mathematics. He was into activism and all kind of stuff. Creating all kinds of. But yeah, of course he did.
To what extent did they crack the Enigma code? Could they sometimes get valuable information from it, or
Oh yeah, they did.
always
Listen, from what, by all accounts, the two things before the atom bomb. Okay, let's leave that alone. The two things that literally brought about Germany's debacle were the success with the Enigma project. They actually anticipated, they intercepted and they decoded, German codes, very successfully. The other one was, of course, the invention of radar. Okay, so yes, it was very successful. Yeah.
On a side note, that's where eat carrots for your eyesight. Have you heard that carrots are good for your vision?
Carrots?
Carrots.
Yeah, I have heard that, right. Yeah.
They were so successful with cracking the Enigma code, they were concerned the Germans would catch on. So they started a huge propaganda campaign in Britain about carrots. Everyone was raising carrots to feed to the RAF pilots, because that's what made them so successful in the bombing.
Oh, okay.
And it was all because of the Enigma.
Yeah, well, the trouble is, for me, I'm also diabetic, and carrots is not good for diabetes. So, anything else?
Sure, one small. Given your experience in cognitive theory, what time frame do you think it would take before a machine would be able to be developed that could actually pass the Turing test?
Oh gosh, well actually, one of your grad students, what's his name? He took my history. He told me in class that in fact there has been some recent work which has led people to think the Turing test has been smashed, has been passed. But I don't know. But if I did know that, my answer to your question is that I never make predictions, and I think everyone's foolish to make technological predictions. Everyone, especially in computing, people like Herbert Simon, they would say, this was in 1956 or 1960, said in 10 years' time, a chess program a computer would be able to beat humans in chess. Well, that happened, but it happened 35, 40 years later on. So making technological predictions, certainly not for me.
Okay. Well, everyone can help themselves to the food we have outside.